Issue: diversity, equity, and inclusion is a far-left ideological fad imported from the U.S., which is being imposed on all sectors of Canadian society by the Liberal government. This hateful ideology holds that the dominant culture and the entire institutional structure of Western societies is your People's Party, redeemably racist, colonialist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic. Of Canada, according to this doctrine, mere neutrality or equal treatment of individuals is insufficient, as it allows for a conscious bias to still have an influence and result in discrimination and disparate outcomes. This systemic disadvantage can only be overcome by prescribing special treatment for minorities. The more a person can demonstrate that he or she belongs to various disadvantaged groups, minus, for example, a Black Muslim lesbian, minus the more he or she should be favored by various programs. Conversely, it is acceptable, or even prescribed, to officially discriminate against white, Christian, heterosexual males who do not identify as another sex or gender. Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms states that every Canadian is equal before and under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. Section 15 qualifies this by allowing so-called affirmative action, that is, any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups. However, DEI goes much further than simply trying to ameliorate the conditions of disadvantaged people, remove unfair barriers, and provide equal opportunities. It creates legally favored groups and groups that can be legally discriminated against on the basis of ethnicity or religion, skin color, sex, gender identification, and sexual orientation. In so doing, it squarely contradicts Section 15 of the Charter. DEI is a fundamentally racist, sexist, and discriminatory ideology that divides Canadians into oppressors and oppressed, creates blatant injustices, and undermines social cohesion. Under the pretext of promoting nice-sounding goals, it does the exact opposite. It imposes a uniform far left perspective and unfairly gives more rights to some, while excluding others who don't fit in official categories of victims. Facts. The Liberal government is imposing DEI programs and policies directly on the public service and all federal institutions, including the armed forces, as well as on federally regulated industries. As a condition to obtain subsidies, grants, loans, scholarships, services, or contracts, the government is also indirectly forcing all kinds of institutions, organizations, associations, and businesses to adopt DEI policies. Such policies not only mandate discrimination in the hiring process and in the provision of various services, they also aim to police speech and behavior and impose conformity of thought at workplaces. You are either actively anti-racist and supportive of DEI policies, or you are a racist. According to far-left ideologues, refusing the tenets of DEI is itself proof that someone is intolerant and should be grounds for disciplinary action or dismissal. DEI training test sessions can have deadly consequences. In 2021, a longtime employee of the Toronto District School Board, Richard Bilkstow, was publicly shamed in front of CO workers by an aggressive Dell trainer, Kike Ojo Thompson, for questioning her claim that Canada was a more racist society than the U.S. The lack of support by the school board and the intense mental distress the situation caused him led him to commit suicide 2 years later. Academic freedom, intellectual rigor, and scientific objectivity are threatened by DEI policies in universities, as only professors belonging to favored groups and willing to bow to the far-left DEI orthodoxy are being hired and can receive federal research grants. Our plan. Radical adherence to DEI principles undermines one of the key foundations of liberal Western civilization, meritocracy. In a free society where everyone is equal under the law, competence, need, and other objective criteria that are fair for everyone must be the sole ones used by the state and other institutions in their dealings with citizens. It is time to restore equal rights for all. A People's Party government will abolish all federal DEI programs and policies in the public service and in federal institutions such as the armed forces, as well as those that apply to federally regulated industries, and prohibit DEI training sessions in all federal institutions. Remove all DEI clauses imposed on institutions, organizations, associations, and businesses as a condition to obtain federal subsidies, grants, loans, scholarships, services, or contracts. DEI ideology also explains various absurd and costly programs, such as the decision by the Trudeau government to force all federal and federally regulated workplaces to make free menstrual tampons available in bathrooms, including men's. Another such program is the Gender-Based Analysis Plus, a type of analysis now performed on all federal government legislation, policies, programs, and other initiatives to ensure that they are responsive, inclusive, and reflective of diverse experiences and realities that go and beyond gender and sex to include consideration of multiple identity factors such as age, disability, economic status, education, gender, sex and sexual orientation, geography, language, racialization and ethnicity, and religion and spirituality. Stop funding groups that promote the DEI ideology. In all legal proceedings, narrowly interpret Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in a manner that prescribes all forms of discrimination. Support Canadians who are being discriminated against, harassed, vilified, or harmed in any way by organizations that impose DEI programs and policies. Issue: the primary aim of Canada's immigration policy should be to economically benefit Canadians and Canada as a whole. It should not be used to forcibly change the cultural character and social fabric of our country. And it should not put excessive financial burdens on the shoulders of Platform for Progressadians in the pursuit of humanitarian goals. However, both the Liberals and Conservatives have supported an irresponsible and unsustainable increase in immigration levels, which has led to an explosion of social, economic, and cultural problems. They are using mass immigration as a political tool to pander for votes among immigrant communities. Facts. In 2023, Canada's population grew at its highest rate since 1957. Almost all this growth was due to international migration, while only a small portion came from Canadians having children. Canada is the fastest growing country in the Western world. Native-born Canadians are being replaced by immigrants. Platform for Progress Immigration imposing a moratorium and deporting illegals. In addition to 472,000 immigrants, there was a net increase of 805,000 non-permanent residents, namely temporary foreign workers, foreign students, and asylum claimants. So, Canada opened its doors to almost 1.3 million foreigners. This represents the entire population of Saskatchewan. It is estimated that almost 7 million non-permanent residents were living in Canada in January 2024. Commonly used arguments in support of higher immigration levels are flawed. For example, it is said that we need more immigrants because our population is aging. More immigrants cannot solve that challenge. Immigrants are a bit younger on average than Canadians, but not enough to have any noticeable impact on the rate of aging. Mass immigration in itself also cannot solve the labor shortages that affect some sectors of the economy. Immigrants are not just workers, but also consumers of goods and services, which creates demand for labor in other sectors and simply displaces the problem. This explains why we still have labor shortages in some sectors, even though Canada has had one of the highest levels of immigration in the world for several years. Mass immigration partly explains why wages and productivity have been stagnant in Canada, as cheap immigrant labor is favored by employers over capital investment and automation. This makes our economy less productive and impedes GDP growth per capita. The economic pie is getting bigger, but not as fast as the growth of our population. We each get a smaller slice. We each get poorer. Young or semi-retired Canadians looking for a part-time job are also driven out of the labor market because of the unfair competition of cheap foreign labor. Mass immigration is expensive for government and taxpayers. Immigrants generally have lower wages than non-immigrants. They pay on average about half as much in income taxes as other Canadians, but consume government services to the same extent. Mass immigration increases pressure on our healthcare system, social programs, and infrastructures. It is the main cause of the housing crisis, with demand far outstripping our capacity to build new homes. Moreover, High home prices are one of the main reasons why young couples cannot afford to start a family and are not having children. And the collapsing birth rate is then used as justification by proponents of mass immigration to bring in more immigrants. Finally, mass immigration does not enrich our culture and does not make our society stronger. On the contrary, it encourages immigrants to live in ethnic ghettos and prevents their proper integration into our society and culture. It brings foreign conflicts and values and attitudes that are incompatible with ours. It lowers our sense of trust and security, and it undermines our social cohesion and national identity. Canada's immigration policy can benefit Canadians only if we welcome the right kind and the right number of immigrants and non-permanent residents. It should prioritize our economic interests and be calibrated in a way that does not jeopardize Canadian values and the maintenance of our national identity. A People's Party government will impose a moratorium on new permanent residents for as many years as necessary until the housing crisis has cooled down. The negative economic impact of mass immigration has been neutralized, and the process of social and cultural disintegration due to mass immigration has been reversed. Thereafter, substantially lower the number of permanent residents Canada accepts every year to between 100,000 and 150,000, depending on economic and other circumstances. Reform the immigration point system and the related programs to accept a larger proportion of economic immigrants with the right skills and high value. Added sectors, while substantially lowering the number of immigrants accepted under the Family Reunification Program, including abolishing the program for parents and grandparents. Increase resources for CSIS, the RCMP, and the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship to conduct thorough background checks and face-to-face interviews with all immigrants to determine if they share Canadian values and societal norms. Deport foreign temporary workers, foreign students, asylum seekers, and visitors who are staying in Canada after their visas have expired or their applications for permanent residency or refugee status have been rejected. Deport permanent residents who obtain their status on the basis of false declarations or who committed crimes. Drastically lower the number of temporary foreign workers and make sure that they only fulfill temporary jobs such as seasonal agricultural work and do not compete with Canadian workers, and substantially lower the number of visas granted to foreign students while eliminating work permits for them, except for academic work on campus. Accept fewer refugees and give priority to refugees belonging to persecuted minority groups who have nowhere to go in neighboring countries, and automatically reject fake asylum claims from visitors, foreign workers, and foreign students who are looking for a way to stay in Canada, and immediately deport them. Change the law to make birth tourism illegal and stop granting Canadian citizenship to babies born in Canada to foreign parents. Take Canada out of the UN's Global Compact for Migration, signed by the Liberal government in 2018, which aims to make it easier for millions of people to move to Canada and other Western democracies at will. Issue. With the active support of all establishment parties, radical woke activists have been People's Party trying for years to impose gender ideology and transform society in a way that curtails of Canada everyone's freedoms. This toxic ideology, which contradicts basic biological realities, is proving particularly harmful to women and children. It teaches children that their gender is determined by stereotypes, and if they do not fit into the traditional male or female gender roles, they are encouraged to think they may have been born in the wrong body. Children are never born in the wrong body. Children should be taught to accept themselves, not seek solutions through pharmaceuticals and medical procedures. Bill C-16, adopted by the Liberal government in 2016, recognized gender self-identification and opened the door to compelled speech. Since then, businesses and government agencies have banned the use of words like "so woman" and "in mother" in favor of menstruating people and birthing people. Women's rights and security are being trampled to accommodate men pretending to be the other sex. Women are encountering men in changing rooms and bathrooms. Violent male criminals who identify as women are being incarcerated in women's prisons. Women have to unfairly compete with men in sports. Cultural fads like drag queen story hours are promoting this ideology among children and making it appear normal to identify as the other sex or as different invented genders. Bill C-4, which was unanimously adopted by all parties in the House of Commons in 2021, criminalizes parents and therapists who try to help minors with gender dysphoria accept who they are. In effect, the law bans inversion therapy in one direction, but allows it in the other. It is illegal to treat children for a mental disorder, but it is legal to encourage them to undergo gender-affirming therapy and mutilate their body. Facts. Most boys and girls suffering from gender dysphoria simply grow out of it. Many suffer from other mental issues such as autism or are under the temporary influence of a phenomenon of social contagion. Taking puberty blockers at a young age will transform their body and sterilize them for life when they are too young to evaluate the impact of such a momentous decision. Sex change surgery involves reconstructing genital organs by using skin and muscles from other parts of the body. These invasive surgeries cause many complications and require lifelong treatments. More and more trans people who underwent such surgeries regret it later in life and want to detransition, but it's tragically too late. The transfer to women's prisons of male inmates who self-identify as women has been standard practice in Canada since it was introduced by the Trudeau government in 2018. It has resulted in criminals with histories of sexual abuse against women being housed alongside female inmates, with several cases of violent behavior being reported in the media. Canadians who believe there are only two immutable sexes must not be compelled to adapt their language and behavior to accommodate gender ideology. In particular, women and children must be protected from its harmful consequences. The normalization of transgender ideology, particularly amongst our youth, will have a catastrophic impact on a whole generation if we do not reverse course soon. A People's Party government will modify the criminal code to outlaw the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and any form of bodily mutilation on minors with the goal of transitioning into another sex. Moreover, any person encouraging minors to transition untent will be held criminally responsible for attempting to cause harm. Remove the ban on helping minors who suffer from gender dysphoria accept their body that was imposed by Bill C-4, the so-called conversion therapy bill. Stop funding groups that promote gender ideology. And strictly enforce Section 163.1 of the Criminal Code in order to remove inappropriate pornographic content from schools and libraries. Protect women's spaces, prisons, shelters, bathrooms, and changing rooms from intrusion by biological men. And forbid biological men to participate in women's sports regulated and funded by the federal government. Abolish federal programs to fund sex change operations for civil servants and prisoners. Repeal Bill C-16, the bill that added gender self-identification as ground for protection against discrimination. Issue: a nation must be based on a sense of people's party belonging, of participating in a common national project, and sharing the same of Canada values. It's only when these sentiments are widely shared that we can develop the trust and common understanding necessary for our society and institutions to function. Issue: in the past, immigrants who came to Canada gradually integrated into our society. They did, of course, keep some aspects of the culture of their country of origin. They became Canadian, but with a distinct flavor. This is a type of multiculturalism that enriches our society. However, over the past decades, the Government of Canada has pursued a policy of official multiculturalism that encourages immigrants to keep the values and culture they left behind instead of integrating into Canadian society and adopting Canadian values and culture. With his cult of diversity, Justin Trudeau has pushed this ideology even further into a form of extreme multiculturalism. He described Canada as the first post-national state, with no core identity. In a free society, immigrants have the right to cherish and maintain their cultural heritage. However, that doesn't mean we have any obligation to help them preserve it, with government programs and taxpayers' money. The vast majority of Canadians rightly expect them to learn about our history and culture, master one of our official languages, and adopt widely shared Canadian values. Facts: Canada is and has always been a diverse country. We have First Nations and Inuit, 2 official languages, a multi-ethnic population, and very different regional cultures. The culture of Nova Scotia is very different from that of Quebec, Alberta, or Nunavut. All these cultures are intrinsically Canadian. They developed in Canada. They don't exist anywhere else in the world. They deserve to be nurtured and to survive. Our distinct values are those of a contemporary Western civilization. They include democracy, individual rights and freedoms, including freedom of religious belief and freedom to criticize religion, equality between men and women, the equal treatment of all citizens regardless of ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation, the rule of law, separation of state and religion, tolerance and pluralism, and loyalty to the wider society instead of to one's clan or tribe. Official multiculturalism is based on the idea that there is no unified Canadian society and no distinct Canadian identity to integrate into, and that we are just a collection of ethnic and religious tribes living side by side. But if we want to keep our country united and ensure social cohesion, we must focus on what unites us as Canadians, not what divides us. A People's Party government will unrepeal the Multiculturalism Act and eliminate all funding to promote multiculturalism. Emphasize instead the integration of immigrants into Canadian society. Impose a moratorium on new permanent residents for as many years as necessary until the housing crisis has cooled down. The negative economic impact of mass immigration has been neutralized, and the process of social and cultural disintegration due to mass immigration has been reversed. Thereafter, substantially lower the number of permanent residents Canada accepts. Every year to between 100,000 and 150,000, depending on economic and other circumstances. Ensure that every candidate for immigration undergoes a face-to-face interview and answers a series of specific questions to assess the extent to which he or she shares Canadian values and societal norms. Issue: the sole priority of the Government of Canada on the international scene should be to manage our relations with other countries in order to protect and further the interests of Canadians. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening. There is a growing trend to dilute national sovereignty and to favor increased international policy coordination, as well as the redistribution of wealth from rich to poor countries under the supervision of the United Nations. This globalist vision, made explicit in the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, has been heavily promoted in Canada under Justin Trudeau, who believes that we are a post-national state with no core identity. Meanwhile, as our national debt continues to mount, the Liberal government spends billions of dollars every year in other countries to solve social and economic problems, spread its woke ideology, and fight so-called climate change. It also wasted $20 billion in weapons and financial aid to support the corrupt Zelensky government during the first 3 years of the war in Ukraine, a proxy war between the U.S. neoconservatives and Russia that doesn't concern us. Facts. Over the past several years, Canada has signed many UN treaties, accords, and compacts on issues ranging from global warming to migration and sustainable development that tie us to the globalist agenda. The United Nations is a dysfunctional organization where non-democratic countries, because of their large numbers, have the most influence. This leads to ridiculous situations. For example, several of the member states on the UN Human Rights Council are among the worst human rights offenders in the world. As one country among almost 200, Canada has no interest in seeing the UN grow into a more powerful quasi-world government. There is no persuasive moral or economic efficiency argument for development aid. Countries that remain poor are those where governments are still crushing private initiative. Until they liberalize their economy and free their citizens, no amount of development aid will solve their problems. On the contrary, it creates a cycle of dependency and often helps these authoritarian governments stay in power. Economic sanctions against Russia were a geopolitical blunder on the West's part that backfired. They destabilized the global economy and pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. There is no reason to treat Russia as our enemy. The war did not. Start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But when the neoconservatives in the U.S. and their allies in Ottawa and European capitals engineered the regime change in Ukraine in 2014, It could have been avoided if NATO had not tried to encircle Russia and had given Putin assurances that Ukraine would never join it as a member. Our plan. Canada needs a common sense foreign policy focused on the security and prosperity of Canadians, not an ideological approach that compromises our interests. People's Party government will continue to work closely with our allies to maintain a peaceful international order without getting involved in foreign conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine, unless we have a compelling strategic interest in doing so. Prioritize relations with our main trading and defense partner, the United States of America, to ensure our prosperity and our security, while diversifying our trade relations with as many other countries as possible to be less dependent on U.S. markets. The Liberals and Conservatives both support getting more involved in this war and contributing to the pointless massacre of hundreds of thousands more Ukrainians and Russians. Pierre Poilievre has said that Canada's contribution was not sufficient, and that he would have sent even more money and weapons to Ukraine. Withdraw from all UN commitments and organizations that threaten our sovereignty, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Compact on Migrations, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the World Health Organization, and reduce our presence in UN institutions to a minimum. Save billions of dollars by phasing out international development aid, and focus Canadian international assistance exclusively on emergency humanitarian action in cases such as conflicts and natural disasters. Issue. The Liberal government has spent billions of dollars at home and abroad to fight global warming, and climate change, as it is now officially called, to account for every natural weather event and its opposite. In order to lower greenhouse gas emissions, it has imposed taxes and countless regulations. It subsidizes inefficient and costly and green technology. And it has blocked the development of oil and gas resources crucial to our prosperity. It is an undisputed fact that the world's climate has always changed and will continue to change. Until 12,000 years ago, much of Canada was under ice, and it is thanks to natural climate change that we can live here today. There is, however, no scientific consensus on the theory that CO2 produced by human activity is causing dangerous global warming, today or will in the future, and that the world is facing environmental catastrophes unless these emissions are drastically reduced. Many renowned scientists continue to challenge this theory. The policy debate about global warming is not grounded on science anymore. It has been hijacked by proponents of big government who are using crude propaganda techniques to impose their views. They publicly ridicule and harass anyone who expresses doubt. They make exaggerated claims to scare people. They even bring Global Warming Platform for Progress and Environment rejecting climate alarmism and focusing on concrete improvements, wash school children, many of whom now suffer from eco-anxiety, and believe the planet is doomed and they have no future. Facts. Climate change alarmism is based on flawed models that have consistently failed at correctly predicting the future. None of the cataclysmic predictions that have been made about the climate since the 1970 seconds have come true. No new ice age, no steady warming in direct relation with increases in CO2 levels, no disappearance of polar ice caps, no exceptional rise in ocean levels, no abnormal increase in catastrophic weather events, no widespread crop failure and famine. In fact, CO2 is beneficial for agriculture, and there has recently been a measurable greening of the world, in part thanks to higher levels. Despite what global warming propaganda claims, CO2 is not a pollutant. It is an essential ingredient for life on Earth and needed for plant growth. According to former Liberal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, the Trudeau government has deployed about 100 different measures to fight climate change. Although the new Carney government has suspended the collection of the consumer carbon tax, the Liberals are planning to add other taxes, programs, and regulations to replace it. Pierre Poilievre has campaigned for years against the carbon tax, but he confirmed that he is not proposing to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. He has never explained how he would fulfill Canada's obligations under that agreement to reach our carbon emissions reduction targets, apart from vague promises to promote green technologies and carbon capture. He has also never said that he would repeal the 100 other measures adopted by the Liberal government. The Liberal and Conservative plans on climate change are the same. Our plan. Given the uncertainties over the scientific basis of global warming and the certainties about the huge costs of measures designed to fight it, there is no compelling reason to jeopardize our prosperity with more government interventions. The People's Party government will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, abandon unrealistic greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and stop sending billions of dollars to developing countries to help them reduce their emissions. Abolish the taxes, regulations, subsidies, and programs adopted by the Liberal government to fight so-called climate change, and instead invest in adaptation strategies to protect Canadians against natural disasters such as floods and forest fires. Prioritize implementing practical solutions to make Canada's air, water, and soil cleaner, including bringing clean drinking water to remote First Nations communities. It is illogical for the government to pretend to care about CO2 emissions and the environment while planning to bring in millions of immigrants, non-permanent residents, and refugees to Canada over the coming years. These people from countries that are poorer than Canada will use more energy, consume more stuff, and need more space for houses built in sprawling cities on land previously used for agriculture or left in a natural state. A larger population inevitably has a larger impact on the environment. Impose a moratorium on new permanent residents for as many years as necessary until the housing crisis has cooled down. The negative economic impact of mass immigration has been neutralized, and the process of social and cultural disintegration due to mass immigration has been reversed. Thereafter, substantially lower the number of permanent residents Canada accepts every year to between 100,000 and 150,000, depending on economic and other circumstances. Issue: Canada's public finances are in a disastrous state. Under the Trudeau Liberals, spending, deficits, and the national debt have exploded. Justin Trudeau exploited the COVID crisis to create a whole series of expensive new programs in areas of provincial jurisdictions such as daycare, pharmacare, and dental care. The Conservatives, NDP, Bloc, and Greens all supported the Liberals' massive COVID spending, and none of them is committed to reducing the size of government. Platform for Progress, this is utterly irresponsible. Because of this fiscal profligacy, inflation reached its highest level since the 1972, and Canadian households have seen their purchasing power dropping fast. When another recession hits, the federal government will be in a precarious fiscal situation and could lose control of its finances. Moreover, no broad-based reduction in the tax burden will ever be possible when our government keeps spending more and more on everything, paying for new programs with borrowed money, and when our national debt keeps growing at an unsustainable rate. Facts. The Liberal government incurred massive deficits in the hundreds of billions of dollars during the pandemic years, and our national debt has more than doubled to reach a record high of 1.3% to $4 trillion in 2025 to 26. These deficits were funded by money printed by the Bank of Canada, which predictably fueled inflation and forced the bank to hike interest rates. Instead of Platform for Progress public finance, downsizing government, balancing the budget, and then cutting taxes. For these deficits directly with taxes, Canadians are paying them indirectly with higher prices on all goods and services, and higher interest payments on mortgages. Even though the exceptional spending of the pandemic years is over, spending has not gone down to pre-COVID levels. The Liberals have permanently increased the size of the federal government. The 2024 fall update is forecasting more deficits for the next 5 years. It's very likely that these deficits will be even higher because of the uncertainty caused by the threat of a trade war with the U.S. and a recession on the horizon. Even though Canada's aging population will continue to weigh on public finances, the Liberals are not putting a single dollar aside for rainy days, but instead continue to spend recklessly as if there is no tomorrow. The number of civil servants has exploded under the Trudeau government. According to the Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat, there were 367,772 employees in the federal public service in 2024, up from 257,034 in 2015, an increase of 43%. Pierre Poilievre voted for the Liberals' massive COVID spending and has refused to condemn their new, unconstitutional programs that intrude on provincial jurisdictions. He has only said that he would cut $1 somewhere for each dollar of new spending, which means a Poilievre conservative government will keep overall spending at the same level and will not reduce the size of government. He offers nothing that substantially differs from the Liberals. Deficits and debts are nothing more than deferred taxes on our children and grandchildren. Instead of buying votes with borrowed money, a responsible government should aggressively cut spending, balance the budget as quickly as possible, and then lower taxes in a prudent manner to put money back into Canadians' pockets. People's Party government will create a new Department of Government downsizing that will systematically review all programs with the goal of abolishing ideologically motivated programs that promote wokeism. Programs whose main purpose is to buy votes, outdated and ineffective programs that don't serve a clear purpose anymore, etc. Eliminate public sector jobs correspondingly. Get rid of the deficit and balance the budget within a year after taking power. Tens of billions of dollars in savings can be found rapidly by eliminating or drastically cutting the budgets of large programs and agencies such as corporate welfare, foreign aid, aid to Ukraine, climate change programs, the CBC, Radio Canada and financial support to media, equalization payments, regional development agencies, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Strategic Innovation Fund, etc. Abolish the new federal programs created by the Trudeau government that intrude on provincial jurisdictions, including the daycare, pharmacare, and dental care programs. Eliminate all other programs that duplicate provincial programs or intrude on provincial jurisdictions so as to focus spending on core federal responsibilities. Cut personal income taxes, corporate taxes, and the personal capital gains tax after the deficit has been eliminated over the course of several budgets, as the fiscal room is found to allow it. Stop using our tax system for political ends and make it simpler and fairer. In particular, eliminate targeted tax measures that are inefficient and serve no compelling public policy purpose. Platform for Progress Housing cooling down an overheated market issue. Housing has become out of reach for many Canadians, in particular for young families living in big cities. Vancouver and Toronto are two of the most unaffordable large cities in the world. Over the past decades, the federal government has spent billions of dollars and created various bureaucratic programs to presumably make housing more affordable, with no results. Among other things, it has manipulated the financial criteria to qualify for mortgages and mortgage insurance, provided tax breaks to first buyers, and funded social housing. The fundamental problem, however, is the mismatch between supply of and demand for housing that Ottawa, the provinces, and municipalities are making worse with other policies, in particular mass immigration and zoning restrictions. Facts. Under the Trudeau government, Canada's population grew at its highest rate since the 1952. In 2023 only, Canada opened its doors to almost 1.3 million foreigners. This represents the entire population of Saskatchewan. It is estimated that almost 7 million non-permanent residents were living in Canada in January 2024. This skyrocketing number of newcomers is one of the main reasons for the constantly high level of demand for housing and the exorbitant prices in Canadian cities. About 40% of immigrants to Canada end up settling in only two cities, Toronto and Vancouver, where the housing shortage is most acute. Even if a lot more houses were to be built, supply cannot keep up with this level of demand. Overall inflation has become a major problem in every sector of the economy, and as a consequence of inflationary monetary policy minus that, is the Bank of Canada having printed too much money in order to fund the Trudeau government's gigantic deficits. This inflationary policy adds to the already overheated conditions in the housing market. Housing is primarily a provincial or local responsibility. Ottawa's involvement over the years has only resulted in distorting the housing market. There is nothing the federal government can do to change provincial or municipal zoning laws, but it can stop contributing to the overheating of the housing market in different ways. People's Party government will impose a moratorium on new permanent residents for as many years as necessary until the housing crisis has cooled down. The negative economic impact of mass immigration has been neutralized, and the process of social and cultural disintegration due to mass immigration has been reversed thereafter. Substantially lower the number of permanent residents Canada accepts every year to between 100,000 and 150,000, depending on economic and other circumstances. Modify the Bank of Canada's inflation target from 2% to 0%. This will cool down inflation in all sectors, including housing. Respect local governments' responsibilities in housing. They should not be subjected to federal financial pressure to densify old neighborhoods of detached homes in order to accommodate mass immigration policies. Privatize or dismantle the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, a mammoth government agency that fuels the housing crisis instead of helping to cool it down. All it has ever done is encourage Canadians to buy houses they can't afford and accumulate massive amounts of debt that the federal government and ultimately Canadian taxpayers will be responsible for. Work with provinces to curb speculation and money laundering by foreign non-resident buyers in Canada's land and housing markets. Issue: a decade of Trudeau government has made Canada a dramatically more dangerous place. After declining for decades, crime is again on the rise, and Canadians don't feel safe anymore walking down the street at night in many cities, or even in their own homes. One obvious way to deter crime is to make it clear to criminals that there are laws and enforcement means in place that make it likely that they will be caught and severely punished. Another is the fear that their victims are going to defend themselves. Any justice system grounded in morality and reason allows self-defense. In Canada, this right is, however, inconsistently applied due to the law's complexity and imprecision. Platform for Progress. There have been many cases over the past years when honest citizens who defended themselves against violent assailants were themselves charged and went on trial because they used force that was not deemed unreasonable in the circumstances and proportionate to the perceived threat. Section 34 of the Criminal Code states in what circumstances individuals can use force to defend themselves or others if force is being used or threatened against them. Section 35 recognizes certain circumstances where an individual is justified in using physical force against another person to protect his or her property from being entered, taken, damaged, or destroyed. Moreover, the Criminal Code specifically makes it illegal to carry and use even non-lethal devices such as pepper spray as modes of defense against potential attackers. This makes women in particular even more defenseless and prone to fall victim to aggression and sexual violence. Facts: Self-Defense Platform for Progress allowing victims of violent crime to defend themselves. According to Ontario lawyer Edward Burlew, who has been involved in self-defense cases involving the use of firearms, although the Criminal Code was amended in 2013 to clarify these self-defense sections, the law remains imprecise and has been dealt with on a very uneven basis. It has been primarily driven by the individual opinions and emotions of police and prosecutors. A good example of this is the case of a Manitoba man, Dakota Pratt, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2019 after being convicted of manslaughter in the death of a person who entered his house in the middle of the night and attacked him with a knife. He took the assailant's weapon and stabbed him 13 times. The judge said he had a right to protect himself but went beyond what was necessary for self-defense, condemning a person to years in prison for having made the wrong assessment of a perceived threat or having used too much force to defend themselves while in a state of panic after being violently attacked is clearly a breach of the universal human right to self-defense. Such legal proceedings can destroy a person's mental health, family life, and livelihood, even when they are not found guilty of an offense. Victims of robbery are typically advised to call the police and avoid any confrontation with assailants while waiting for the police to arrive. In rural areas, however, police stations are often far away, and it can take a long time for the police to arrive on the scene of a crime. The threat that a victim may retaliate with force is a crucial way to deter crime. Criminal Code regulations list pepper spray as a prohibited weapon. Section 92 of the Criminal Code makes it illegal to possess and carry pepper spray for self-defense and punishable by imprisonment for up to 10 years. Canadians should be able to defend themselves in circumstances where they are violently attacked or are victims. of robbery in their own homes without fear of criminal charges. Everybody, and women in particular, should be allowed to carry effective means of self-defense against aggressors and rapists. A People's Party government will amend Section 34 of the Criminal Code to clarify and fortify the right to self-defense and increase the burden of proof necessary to charge and convict victims who used force to defend themselves against a violent attacker. Amend Section 35 of the Criminal Code to include the concept of the inviolability of one's home, known as castle doctrine, that allows victims to use force to defend themselves against a violent intruder, free from legal prosecution. Amend the Criminal Code to remove pepper spray from the list of prohibited weapons and make it legal to possess and carry it for self-defense. Issue: Canada's public healthcare system has the dubious distinction of having the worst wait times of any developed country. Healthcare costs have been increasing at an unsustainable rate, putting more and more financial pressures on the budgets of provincial governments. The situation is likely to get worse with Canada's aging population. And as we saw during the COVID pandemic, our healthcare system is too rigid and bureaucratized to quickly adapt to a crisis situation. Healthcare is an exclusive provincial jurisdiction. However, for years, the federal government has insisted that the provinces satisfy a series of conditions set in the Canada Health Act in exchange for transfer payments. These conditions discourage innovation. Also, the money sent by Ottawa does not directly fund healthcare services. It is simply added to the province's budgets, and they decide where and how to spend it. Such confusion and undue interference lead to bickering between Ottawa and the provinces over who is responsible for the failings of our healthcare system and how much money Ottawa should contribute. It prevents the implementation of sound reforms. Platform for Progress Healthcare, giving provinces the incentives to deal with wait times and rising costs. Facts: Canada is among the OECD countries that spend the most on healthcare. Ottawa's healthcare transfers to the provinces have more than doubled since 2006, from $20 billion to $52 billion in 2024 to 25, with nothing to show for it. The fundamental problem is that we are the only developed country where the government has a monopoly on medically required care. All other OECD countries have universal mixed private-public systems that guarantee citizens equal access. Patients in these countries have a lot more choice than Canadians. They can be treated in public or private hospitals, with the government or their private insurance paying for the treatment. Wait times are non-existent or very short, and nobody is denied care because of low income. It's time for Canada to implement reforms in line with the more efficient and less costly mixed universal systems of other developed countries. Throwing more federal money at the problem, as all the other parties are proposing, is not the right approach. On the contrary, it is part of the problem. Provincial governments will never make the tough decisions if they can always blame Ottawa for not sending enough money. We must end the current confusion over who does what and who is responsible for the problem. People's Party government will repeal the Canada Health Act and create the conditions for provincial and territorial governments to set up mixed private, public universal systems like other developed countries. They will be fully responsible for healthcare funding and management and fully accountable to their citizens for the results, while Ottawa will respect the Constitution and stop meddling. Replace the Canada Health Transfer cash payments with a permanent transfer of tax points of equivalent value to give them a stable source of revenue. In practice, Ottawa will give up its goods and services tax and let provincial and territorial governments occupy this fiscal room. In 2024 to 25, the GST is expected to bring in about $52 billion in revenues, which is the same amount transferred by Ottawa to fund healthcare. Establish a temporary program to compensate poorer provinces whose revenues from the new tax points will be lower than the health transfer payments they used to receive. Platform for Progress Economy, encouraging investment and productivity growth. Issue: there are only two ways to create more wealth and prosperity. We can either work more or work more efficiently through increased productivity. Investments in RAND, innovation, more efficient production processes, machinery, and equipment are critical to improvements in productivity and living standards. improved productivity leads to better, higher-paying jobs and therefore a higher standard of living. And in a context where there are manpower shortages in many sectors, investment is a way to increase production without necessarily having to employ more workers. Unfortunately, in the last decade, Canada's business climate has become less and less welcoming to both domestic and foreign investors. Business investment has gone down, and our productivity is lagging that of most other industrialized countries. This slowdown of productivity, coupled with the Trudeau government's mass immigration policies, means that we have more and more people to support with a stagnating economy. Instead of growing, GDP per capita and our standard of living are declining. More government intervention in the economy is not the answer to our economic challenges. Every time the government takes an additional dollar in taxes or borrows it, this is a dollar that individuals or business people will not be able to spend or invest. Facts. A 2018 study by the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary found $14 billion worth of direct and indirect federal business subsidies every year. This number is certainly much higher today, the Trudeau government having announced in 2023 $32 billion in subsidies to only two companies producing batteries for electric vehicles and planning to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies in the coming years to fight so-called climate change. Subsidies do not spur more economic activity. On the contrary, they create inefficiencies and market distortions by unfairly favoring some companies or sectors at the expense of others. According to the latest OECD figures, Canada's combined federal-provincial corporate income tax rate is the 12th highest amongst the 38 OECD countries. A more competitive tax rate would ensure that Canadian businesses become more profitable, pay higher salaries, and invest more. By reducing the return on investment, a capital gains tax not only lowers overall investment, it also hinders the allocation of capital to its most efficient uses and discourages riskier ventures that are likely to bring more innovation. Many of our trading partners do not tax capital gains. There was no capital gains tax in Canada until 1972. Abolishing it would encourage every Canadian to save and invest more, and would give our entrepreneurs access to a larger pool of capital. The benefits to our economy would vastly exceed the loss of government revenues. Ottawa should stop taking billions of dollars from the private sector and redistributing them through subsidies. It should instead lower taxes for all businesses and encourage saving and investment to make our economy more productive. A People's Party government will eliminate all corporate subsidies and other inefficient government interventions that unfairly support some companies or business sectors. This will generate savings of tens of billions of dollars every year. Gradually reduce over the course of one mandate the corporate income tax rate from its current 15% down to 10%. When completed, this measure will make about $16 billion available to businesses, allowing them to increase salaries or invest in productivity improvements. Over the course of one mandate, gradually abolish the personal capital gains tax by decreasing the inclusion rate from the current 50% down to 0%. End the Trudeau government's policy of mass immigration as a solution to manpower shortages, and focus instead on encouraging businesses to invest and improve their productivity. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer's Ready Reckoner website, July 2023 issue. The Canadian Armed Forces has a proud history and used to be one of the most capable and respected military forces in the world. Unfortunately, successive Liberal and Conservative governments have largely chosen to forget this proud history. They have starved our military forces of funds, equipment, and support, and broken their trust with those platformed for progress, who made an exceptional personal commitment to put life and limb at risk in the interests of the nation. The backbone of any military is the character of the men and women who serve. The fastest way to demoralize and undermine a country's military is to fail to look after injured soldiers when they return home, or to provide for the families of those who did not make it back. Facts. Until 2006, veterans injured or disabled during military service received a tax-free lifetime disability pension under the Pension Act, as determined by a veteran's disability assessment, including support and survivor benefits for spouses and dependent children. Veterans Platform for Progress, standing behind the men and women who sacrificed for our country. On April 1, 2006, the new Veterans Charter replaced those pensions with a one-time lump sum disability payout that is wholly inadequate, leaving many injured and disabled veterans in dire financial straits. It created two classes of veterans. Although the Trudeau government promised the re-establishment of a lifelong disability pension, a pension for life, it actually amounts to a hodgepodge of existing benefits recycled and repackaged as something new. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has calculated that the pension for life provides the average veteran lifetime payments less than 1/3 of what would have been provided under the Pension Act. Moreover, it has become increasingly difficult for veterans to navigate all the programs and obtain the benefits they are entitled to. When a veteran who had lost a leg asked Justin Trudeau at a town hall why his government was still fighting veterans groups attempting to get the support they were promised, Trudeau answered, "And because they're asking for more than we are able to give right now." The Government of Canada has an obligation to honor the nation's sacred commitment to our military men and women, and ensure veterans and their families receive adequate recognition and benefits for the sacrifices they make, including care, treatment, and fair compensation for injury or death and return to civilian life. The People's Party government will and recognize and respect the unique sacrifices of those who served in Canada's armed forces. Enshrine in legislation the country's obligations to our veterans in a military covenant between the government and those who serve in the armed forces. And reinstate the fair disability pension for veterans as previously provided for by the Pension Act. The pension will apply retroactively to 2006, and lump sum payments received since then will be treated as advance payments. Re-emphasize the legislative guarantee of the benefit of doubt and standard under the Pension Act. Instigate a line-by-line review of the new Veterans Charter to determine which policies and programs should be retained, simplify the system, and make it easier to navigate. Issue. Under the influence of radical environmental activists and American left-wing foundations, the Trudeau government has People's Party done everything it can to stifle the growth of Canada's oil industry by preventing it from transporting and selling its products. With Bill C-48, the Liberals imposed a ban on oil tanker traffic on the north coast of British Columbia, which brought the cancellation of the Northern Gateway and Eagle Spirit pipeline projects. After years of legal uncertainty, investors pulled out of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project and sold it to the federal government for $4.5 billion. Unrealistic environmental requirements from the National Energy Board also killed the Energy East pipeline. Bill C-69 makes the process of building pipelines and other major energy projects so complex and difficult that it could prevent any new investment. Among other things, that bill requires projects to be analyzed based on the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors. Almost all natural gas transportation and export projects proposed in recent years have been abandoned. Finally, the Biden administration canceled the Keystone XL pipeline project, and the Michigan governor has been trying to shut down the crucially important Line 5 that carries oil and natural gas liquids from Western Canada to Ontario and Quebec. Because of these constraints, capital investments in the oil and gas industry collapsed, allowing our oil and gas industry to grow. Our overdependence on the American market for exports also costs the Canadians' economy billions of dollars in foregone revenues every year. Alberta's economy suffered a major setback for several years, with tens of thousands of jobs disappearing in the oil patch, and many more in local communities that depend on this industry. Facts. Researcher Vivian Krause has spent years documenting a well-organized campaign to landlock Canada's oil, funded by American foundations such as the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Tides Foundation. Almost all the groups involved in various types of campaigns and court cases against pipeline construction received money from them. Despite the emergence of alternative sources of energy, global demand for oil is expected to keep rising for several decades. Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world and is well placed to answer this demand. If this oil doesn't come from Alberta and Saskatchewan, it will come from elsewhere, mostly countries with poor environmental or human rights standards such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. And if it is not transported by pipelines, it will be transported by rail, a much more dangerous method for both the environment and humans, as we saw with the Lac-Mégantic tragedy. The oil and gas industry has been for decades a major source of employment, government revenues, and economic well-being for all of Canada. It should be allowed to grow, export its products, and bring prosperity to our country. The People's Party government will counter anti-oil and anti-pipeline propaganda from radical environmentalists and foreign foundations. Repeal Bill C-48. Repeal Bill C-69. Approve pipelines projects using a streamlined process. Find a private buyer for Trans Mountain. Reassert federal jurisdiction over pipelines construction by invoking Section 92 of our Constitution, if necessary, whereby Parliament can declare any project to be for the general advantage of Canada. Work with industry and with our American partners to revive canceled projects and keep Line 5 in operation. Issue. The use of firearms has always been part of Canadian tradition and culture. Today, there are over 2 million hunters, ranchers, trappers, farmers, target shooters, recreational shooters, and collectors who possess firearms in our country. However, despite this group being exceptionally law-abiding and the most highly vetted segment in the Canadian population, the existing firearms legislation unfairly targets them, does not respect their property rights, and is highly arbitrary. Since 2019, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau has pursued a course of highly aggressive restrictions that criminalize most responsible and peaceful firearm owners. Firearm owners are currently subject to the most hostile assault on their rights in over a generation. Platform for Progress Firearms, respecting legitimate firearms owners and targeting criminals. Facts. In 1995, Bill C-68 created the Firearms Act, the strictest gun control legislation in Canadian history. Its most controversial feature, the creation of a long gun registry, was repealed in 2012. The Act continues to classify firearms into different categories for reasons which frequently have nothing to do with their function. Firearms can also be assigned new classifications at the whim of a bureaucrat. What is legal one day can become illegal the next. Under the licensing system of the Act, the ownership of firearms has become a privilege that can be revoked or altered at any moment. Legitimate gun owners can lose their property and even have their life ruined by being criminally charged through their inaction or due to the moving goalposts of Canadian firearms law. Canada's firearms legislation must protect society from the criminal misuse of firearms and prioritize the deterrence and punishment of criminals. Peaceful and responsible firearms owners deserve a legal framework that protects their property rights and treats them with fairness and respect. We need a common-sense approach to gun control that promotes safety while removing the threat of arbitrary criminal prosecution. A People's Party government will replace the Firearms Act and supporting legislation with new legislation that will prioritize effective measures to improve public safety and fight crime in Canada. Replace the costly and burdensome licensing system with an efficient lifetime certification system for firearms owners following mandatory vetting, safety training, and testing. To avoid criminalizing peaceful and responsible gun owners and guarantee their property rights, this system will legalize simple possession of firearms for certified Canadians as long as they use their firearms lawfully and don't commit some other crime that would disqualify them from firearms ownership. Require that all firearms categories be based on function, not on looks or arbitrary political whims, and reclassify all firearms based on the simplified classification system as proposed by the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. This will remove ineffective restrictions which unfairly target sport shooters, but have no deterrent effect on criminals. Repeal the Trudeau government's 2020 and 2024 cabinet decisions to ban more than 1,800 types of firearms. Repeal Trudeau's Bill C-71, which imposes a set of new restrictions on licensed gun owners and businesses that sell firearms, and Bill C-21, which freezes the sale and transfer of handguns and arbitrarily adds certain types of rifles and shotguns to the list of banned firearms. Mandate that all future changes to firearms regulation be made by Parliament only. This means that neither the RCMP nor Cabinet will be able to move the legal goalpost for firearms owners without the approval of Parliament. issue. When it was started in 1957, the equalization program had a noble intention to ensure that all Canadians have access to a similar level of services from their provincial government, regardless of whether they live in richer or poorer provinces. Equalization was seen as a way to unite the country. Unfortunately, that is not how it turned out. The program is unfair and inefficient, both for citizens of richer provinces that do not receive equalization payments like Alberta and Saskatchewan, and for citizens of provinces that have been on the receiving end for decades, because it keeps these provinces in a state of dependency and underdevelopment. Equalization payments encourage recipient provinces to maintain large public sectors, keep taxes high, and intervene more in their economies, which drives out investment and lowers employment and productivity. They don't have the correct incentives to make their economies more competitive and develop their natural resources, because more private sector growth will lead to smaller equalization payments. It's a poverty trap. Facts. Equalization payments were first introduced in 1957. The 1982 Constitution Act includes a vaguely worded commitment to the principle of equalization, the goal being to ensure that provinces that have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. In 2025 to 26, the equalization program will transfer more than $26.2 billion to provinces. Quebec will receive $13.6 billion, Manitoba $4.7 billion, Nova Scotia $3.5 billion, New Brunswick $3.1 billion, Prince Edward Island $666 million, Ontario $546 million, and Newfoundland and Labrador $113 million. The governments of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan will not receive any payments. Under the current formula, the total amount of equalization payments increases steadily, in accordance with nominal GDP, even when there is a reduction in wealth disparities among the provinces. Provinces should not be receiving equalization payments for decades, just like individuals should not be receiving welfare checks all their lives. It's time to stop rewarding provincial governments for not adopting better economic policies. The Constitution does not commit the federal government to spend tens of billions of dollars every year on equalization, does not prescribe any specific formula, and does not define what unreasonably comparable levels of public services and means. People's Party government will bring down substantially the total amount of equalization payments to provinces, end the yearly automatic increases in accordance with nominal GDP, and make sure that only the provinces with the greatest needs benefit from it. Establish a parliamentary committee to review and make recommendations on a new formula that will avoid the welfare trap, and provide poorer provinces with the right incentives to adopt pro-growth economic policies and reduce their dependence on federal money. Ensure that the new formula respects our Constitution, makes provincial governments more responsible for their policy decisions, and is fair for citizens of all provinces. Updated March 2025. Protecting Canadians from Censorship and Discrimination. Issue. The rights of Canadians to freely hold and express beliefs are being eroded at an alarming speed under the Trudeau government. Some of its decisions even require that Canadians renounce their most deeply held moral convictions and express opinions they disagree with. People's Party in 2018, the Liberal government denied summer job funding to organizations of Canada, including charities, that would not sign an attestation supporting abortion. It also passed Bill C-16 as part of a trend to force Canadians to express support for the existence of various gender identities, beyond the biological categories of issue male and female, and to use pronouns demanded by those who identify with these other genders. In addition to these assaults on conscience, the government launched a series of regulatory attacks on free speech on the internet and is pressuring social media companies, which are already censoring speech that isn't politically correct, to crack down even more. It is also considering bringing back Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. This hate speech provision was repealed by the Conservative government in 2013 because it was being used arbitrarily to censor statements that offended some people on the internet. In what appears to be a first step towards restricting our right to criticize Platform for Progressive Religions, it adopted M103, a motion that condemns religious discrimination but only specifically mentions one religion, Islam, and without defining the term Islamophobia. Finally, on university campuses, a growing number of faculty and administrators, those who should be fighting for open debate of controversial ideas, have become aggressive advocates for censorship. Facts. History and social scientific research show that freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, when maximally protected, advance the intellectual life of a nation, foster greater ideological diversity and societal understanding, and nurture other freedoms necessary for a successful democracy. This is why Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees citizens freedom of conscience and religion as well as freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. What some people find politically incorrect, offensive, or even hateful cannot serve as the legal basis for discrimination and censorship. Canadians should be able to enjoy maximum freedom of conscience and expression as guaranteed in Section 2 of the Charter. The People's Party government will restrict the definition of hate speech in the criminal code to expression which explicitly advocates the use of force against identifiable groups or persons based on protected criteria such as religion, race, ethnicity, sex, or sexual orientation. Repeal any existing legislation or regulation curtailing free speech on the Internet and prevent the reinstatement of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. Repeal Bill C-16 and Motion M-103. Repeal Bill C-11, which could be used to regulate user content on streaming platforms. Abolish all public funding to Canadian media and ensure that they are completely independent and free from government influence. Ensure that Canadians can exercise their freedom of conscience to its fullest extent as it is intended under the Charter and are not discriminated against because of their moral convictions. Withhold federal funding from any post-secondary institution shown to be violating the freedom of expression of its students or faculty. Platform for Progress Indigenous Issues, a new relationship based on mutual respect. Issue. The Indigenous population of Canada is extremely diversified. It accounts for about 5% of Canada's population and comprises First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. There are more than 600 First Nations communities dispersed across the country. More than half of First Nations Canadians don't live on reserves. Indigenous issues are also very complex. Some communities are prosperous, others much poorer than the Canadian average. Many suffer from critical social issues, including homelessness, crime, Platform for Progress domestic violence, substance abuse, and suicide. Many don't have the basic services that we take for granted, such as access to clean water. There are other major issues to address regarding treaty negotiations, housing, property rights on reserves, residential schools, etc. It is not possible to address more than a few of these issues in the context of this platform. We focus on what a People's Party government would prioritize on the basis of its 4 key principles. Facts. Many injustices were committed in the past by the Canadian government towards Indigenous peoples, some of which are still ongoing. We cannot rewrite the past, but only seek the best way to live together harmoniously in the future. This relationship must be based on mutual respect and a balanced approach taking into account the needs of the Indigenous population and the interests of the Canadian population as a whole. The lack of real private property on reserves is in part responsible for the poor state of housing and the social ills that derive from it, and is one of the greatest impediments to economic development. Fairness demands that all Canadians benefit from roughly equivalent services wherever they live. It's unacceptable that some Indigenous communities live in conditions that resemble those of third world countries. But the current model to solve these problems is based on top-down bureaucratic solutions imposed by Ottawa on dependent communities with no voice in the process. Although federal spending on Indigenous programs has almost tripled from $11 billion when the Liberals were elected in 2015 to $32 billion. In 2025, there is little evidence that living conditions have been improving in Indigenous communities. The federal government and Indigenous administrations have a responsibility to ensure that taxpayers' money is well spent. Our plan. Though it is not possible to address more than a few of these issues in the context of this platform, a People's Party government would prioritize reforms for Indigenous communities based upon our 4 founding principles of freedom, responsibility, fairness, and respect. A People's Party government will replace the paternalistic Indian Act, which keeps Indigenous people in a state of dependency and allows the federal government to control most aspects of their lives, with a new legal framework that guarantees them equal rights and responsibilities as Canadians and promotes the self-reliance of communities. Reaffirm the federal government's power to approve natural resources and infrastructure projects after adequate consultations with affected Indigenous groups and in partnership with them to ensure they can benefit from these economic opportunities. Explore further avenues to promote the establishment of individual property rights on reserves so as to empower its residents and give them increased control over their lives. Ensure that Indigenous communities take more ownership of the services they receive in partnership with Ottawa and other levels of government. Review federal spending to ensure that programs are better targeted to benefit the Indigenous population, in particular the communities that have the greatest needs. This policy was first released in 2019, updated February 2025. Issue: Supply management is a government-imposed cartel that keeps the prices of dairy, poultry, and eggs artificially high through the control of production, the banning of imports, price fixing, and the prevention of competition in the market. The system forces producers to buy of Canada quotas, which grant permission to produce a set amount. For example, it costs between $20,000 and $40,000 to get the right to milk 1 cow. It keeps out imports by imposing exorbitant tariffs that range from 150% for eggs to 300% for butter. Because our market is closed to most imports, our farmers are not allowed to export their products. Although they account for only about 10% of all Canadian farms, farmers under supply management constitute one of the most influential lobbies in Ottawa. In order to satisfy one small but powerful lobby, we restrict the development of other businesses and prevent the creation of thousands of jobs in these other sectors. When Canada negotiates free trade agreements with other countries, protecting the system always ends up as the focus of talks. Canada could have obtained a better deal during negotiations with the U.S. and Mexico to renew platform for Progress NAFTA in 2018 if we had put supply management on the table, as demanded by President Trump back then. Since his return to the White House in January 2025, Canada's trade relations with the U.S. have deteriorated, and supply management remains one of the most contentious issues. Negotiations for a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom also broke down in 2024, in part over the issue of opening our market to English cheeses. Facts. According to the OECD, Canadian consumers had to pay $3.6 billion more every year between 2011 and 2015% for all products under supply management. A 2015 study done by University of Manitoba economists showed that the system imposes a financial burden of $339 annually on the poorest 20% of Canadian households, which is the equivalent of a 2.3% tax on their incomes. The claim that supply management is essential to keep dairy farms alive is false. Since the early 1972, when supply management was introduced, the number of dairy farms in Canada has dropped from about 145,000 to about 10,000 today. More than 90% have disappeared. The exorbitant price of quotas makes it impossible for young farmers to start a farm under supply management. The amount market and value of quotas was estimated at $35 billion in 2016, but that's not what it would cost the government to buy them back if it decided to abolish the system. The accounting value. Our plan. The supply management system is inefficient and fundamentally unfair to consumers, farmers, and other sectors of our economy. A People's Party government will create a free, open, and fair system in the dairy, poultry, and egg sectors that will save Canadians billions of dollars annually thanks to the lower prices they will pay for these products while improving our trade relations with the U.S. and other partners. of quotas after depreciation would form the basis for compensation. Farmers who bought them recently would be reimbursed close to the market value, while those who bought them at lower prices years ago would get less, and those who got them for free would get nothing. The Conference Board of Canada estimated such a buy out would cost between $3.6 billion and $4.7 billion in total. Phase out the supply management system over a number of years to allow farmers to adapt, and compensate them for the lost value of their quotas. Allow Canada's dairy, egg, and poultry farmers to innovate, thrive, and sell their products internationally. Issue: more than a century and a half after Canada's founding, Canadians still cannot buy, sell, or work freely within their own country. In order to protect local special interests, provincial governments have adopted all kinds of People's Party of Canada measures that erect barriers to trade and labor mobility. Goods such as alcohol and agricultural products cannot be sold freely across provincial borders because of government monopolies or regulations. Nurses, accountants, or engineers have problems finding work in another province because their skills are not automatically recognized. Safety rules vary from one province to another. In some cases, it is easier for a Canadian company to sell its product in another country than in another province or territory. This hinders competition and impedes the growth of firms. Canadian consumers are therefore forced to pay more for goods and services. This is not what the Fathers of Confederation had intended. Section 121 of the Constitution states that goods, getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, must be admitted free into each of the other provinces. However, in the 2018 Como case, the Supreme Court ruled that measures which have the effect of limiting trade are unconstitutional only if it can be demonstrated that this is their primary purpose. This level of proof would be extremely difficult to establish in most cases. Facts: the 1994 Agreement on Internal Trade negotiated between Ottawa, the provinces, and the territories failed to eliminate barriers. Its successor, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, came into force in 2017, but almost half of its 345 pages contain exceptions and opt-out measures, rendering it ineffective. From an economic point of view, interprovincial barriers have the same effect as customs tariffs imposed on imports from other countries. According to a Statistics Canada study, the level of trade within Canada corresponds to what would be expected if each province imposed a 7% tariff on men imports and of goods and services from other provinces. A 2016 study published in the Canadian Journal of Economics concluded that interprovincial trade barriers cost Canadians roughly $100 billion in lost. Our plan: it is time for the federal government to reassert its authority and leave